Hey everyone! Thanks for joining us for the next episode of our Learn Live series, Set Up Landing Zones for AI. My name is Anna. I'm an event planner for Reactor, joining you from Redmond, Washington. Before we start, I do have some quick housekeeping. Please take a moment to read our code of conduct. We seek to provide a respectful environment for both our audience and presenters. While we absolutely encourage engagement in the chat, we ask that you please be mindful of your commentary, remain professional and on topic. Keep an eye on that chat. We'll be dropping helpful links and checking for questions for our presenters to answer live. Our session is being recorded. It will be available to view on demand right here on the Microsoft Reactor channel. With that, I'd love to turn it over to our speakers for today. Thanks so much for joining.
G'day viewers, my name's Orin Thomas and today I'm here with Sonia Cuff and Ben Brower and we're going to be talking about Azure AI Landing Zones and a bit about how they relate to an AI Center of Excellence. I'm a Principal Cloud Advocate here at Microsoft. Sonia, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi everybody, welcome back. If you've joined us for the previous two sessions, I am indeed Sonia Cuff, Principal Cloud Advocate Lead at Microsoft. Over to you, Ben.
Hello, everyone. Nice to be back. My name is Ben Brower. I'm a Senior Product Marketing Manager focused on patterns and practices within Azure.
Okay, so today we're going to be covering the following topics. The first thing that we're going to get into is a bit of a discussion about how you understand Azure Landing Zones and why and how they relate to an AI Center of Excellence should your organization be used, and why your organization should be thinking about this approach, independent of what size your organization is. We'll talk about the different Azure Landing Zone design areas. We'll talk about the difference between a platform landing zone and an application landing zone. And we're then going to look at a particular example that we've got on the Microsoft website that is about a particular application workload and how it fits into this sort of paradigm of landing zones. On this first slide, I'll just jump back here for a sec. This is related to a training module that we've got up on learn.microsoft.com. So if you want to, after the session, go and look at this in more detail, all of the material that we're covering here is also recapitulated over in the module. So, Ben and Sonia, what on earth is a landing zone for?
That's a really good question, Orin. The cool thing about landing zones to me is that they're not a product that Microsoft sells. And they're not something that we expect customers to go and deploy as is straight out of the box. So they're going to require a bit of customization, but they are designed to help you architect your applications and the underlying platform infrastructure to best practices based on your organizational needs, and then do that in a templated way so that you maintain the control. And they cover all of the different areas that we've talked about in our previous sessions when we're talking about the design considerations for workloads and AI workloads.
Ben?
Yeah, exactly. I love the fact that we don't sell this as a product. It's really something that people should use. It's codified best practices, what's nice about that is these are best practices that have been developed with working with many customers over the years. These are coming from our customers who are both large and small. So that's an important distinction. There's a myth there that this is only for large customers. But it's nice that we have this kind of set of best practices that are implementable. And so the idea that there's a landing zone, an Azure landing zone, which is prescriptive in nature, is a nice way to get the ball rolling, basically.
And one of the things that when we talk about, we've learnt from customers, what we're really saying is that we've gone out and we've looked at where customers have done something and it might not have gone exactly the best way, and that we're trying to find a way to guide you away, have some railings there, that we've seen this go badly. So what we're trying to do is mitigate it going badly for you. And sometimes it sounds like, oh, we've just arbitrarily decided what these best practices are. It's more a matter of, okay, we know that this puts constraints on you and we're guiding you in a particular direction. But the reason that we're doing is that if you get a bit off this beaten track, you might actually end up having problems that might actually end up causing you far more grief than you were expecting. So the next thing that we'll talk about is Azure AI landing zones. So this is a specific version. So when did we start with talking about landing zones, Ben? You've sort of been in this area for a while.
So the first landing zone, the first platform landing zone that we came out with was in 2018, and that was based on what we were just saying, that landing zones are best practices or prescriptive guidance that you can take with you and implement. And so we realized that in 2018, it was an important new construct when it came to cloud. You needed this for migrating or coming to the cloud. And then ever since then, we've been basically building on top of that. And now what we have are application landing zones, which we'll talk about later, which are basically environments on which you run these, on which you run a platform. So it's kind of that next step in development of your landing zone.
So one of the things, sorry, Sonia, you go.
Right. Yeah, I was just going to ask Ben. So if I'm looking to develop a new AI application in my company, should I be looking at landing zones for some suggestions of how to architect the AI application?
Yes and no. Yes, in that if you're planning to deploy this this particular workload into production, then yes, you should be considering using an AI landing zone here, that's using Azure, hosted on Azure. But if what you're doing is just kind of playing around, kind of getting a sense for how this workload, how AI works, and you just have a couple people whom you're trying to just get a sense of how they would use the solution, then you probably don't need to deploy this within a landing zone environment. So that's kind of the answer I would give there.
One of the things that when I was sort of trying to come to terms with the idea of what a landing zone was when I was going through and looking at it, it was understanding that what really I was meant to be doing when I was looking at a landing zone, and feel free to push back on this, was that it was giving me sort of a very theoretical version of what an idealized application would look like. So that I was looking at an application in a specific area. So obviously today we're talking about AI applications, and that what you're not doing is you're not pressing a button and then having an environment automatically hydrated for you. But there is the option of saying, look, we've got these tools that will hydrate an environment, but what you should really be doing is, instead of just pressing the big green button at the beginning, you should actually be pulling these tools apart, working them out for what your environment looks like, and using these tools as a starting point rather than as a deployment point. So it's not like a sort of an ARM template or a bicep template that's going to be push button get environment. It's really well, here's some templates, but you really should be from the beginning taking these and modifying it. Is that a reasonable interpretation of what a landing zone is?
Yes, it's like similar to most reference architectures in the Azure Architecture Center. Is you want to look at these as kind of baseline architectures that you need to modify. In fact, we did some research on this subject a couple of years ago, where we asked I think it was about 150 enterprise architects, like, how do they go about using the Azure Architecture Center and the reference architectures there? 95% said that they customize and tailor those reference architectures. The same goes with landing zones.
So when we're talking about, because the theme of this entire set of presentations is the AI COE, it's important to this discussion we've just had about what a landing zone is and what it implies and what it doesn't imply. It's important for your COE to have this very much in mind, that this is sort of a reference against what you can use and sort of backstop and think about when you're thinking about these workloads, rather than it being a sort of an extremely prescriptive, these are the absolute things that you must do, and this is exactly what your workload should look like. Because what you don't want on your COE, and this is really when you're constituting your COE, you don't want to be sitting there and having people have misunderstandings about what some of these conceptual items are, because they might be like, well, you want to go and do this, but I've gone and looked and Microsoft doesn't have that particular architecture on their website. And if you're not compliant with what Microsoft says on their website, you're wrong.
Yeah, I love that you've got on the slide about it making those designs consistent and repeatable. Back in the old days when I was the sysadmin, I used to look after servers. As soon as you get more than one person deploying something into production, you've now got two different ways to do it, right? Probably more than two different ways, depending on whether or not that resource then gets changed in the future. But how we used to document settings that we could put on, or group policies, or whatever it was very rudimentary, because we didn't have a lot of tools to be able to do that other than document this literally inside a Word document. But I love that both the advent of the cloud and infrastructure as code, and now things like these Azure Landing Zones, means that it fits really nicely into that aspect of the COE, where we're talking about the COE being both enabling the sharing of best practices across your organization, assuming you have more than one team deploying AI workloads, but also, even if you don't, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, to just ensure that consistency is in place. It's kind of a thing that's really resonated me in terms of how far we've come with being able to provide tooling to support that. But again, with the flexibility that you can both enforce and share the best practices that are relevant to your organization, and you're not starting with a blank piece of paper now. We're actually giving you some ideas and some suggestions that you can build on.
So the next thing we'll talk about is Azure Landing Zone design areas. But there's a question in the chat about, or a comment in the chat that says landing zones sounds similar to platform engineering. And I know that we were sort of going to hit this maybe later in the talk, but Ben, do you want to give a quick demarcation guide to what these sort of ideas and these terms mean?
Yeah. So first, I would probably differentiate not landing zones and platform engineering, but AI COE and platform engineering teams, because what you're doing there is you're comparing apples to apples in that case, because what you have an AI COE is a virtual team. It's a group of people who have cross-functional requirements or cross-functional skills or responsibilities. The same goes with platform engineering. Platform engineering is a group of engineers or IT professionals who are supporting the overall platform in various cross-functional ways. And so they're very similar in that nature, or in that regard. But where they begin to change, or where they begin to differentiate, is AI COE takes and just COEs in general, take a much broader perspective on what you're trying to do in the organization, or how you're trying to move a given technology, adopt a given technology within the organization. And so with AI, you have a variety of additional personas, I'll call them, or people who are going to be involved that may not be involved in platform engineering. As an example, a change management person, or you have a business stakeholder who may not be part of a platform engineering team per se.
Yeah, and we discussed that in the previous in our sessions, where we talked about the elements. One of the elements of the COE was really to make sure that there was clear communication to the workload teams about whether or not a particular workload was aligning with what the business goals were. It wasn't that you were just out there doing something really cool with AI, but that the AI workload itself, the investment that was put into the AI workload, was something that was going to pay off in the long term for the business as a whole, whereas a platform engineering team is obviously much more focused on the ins and outs of the technology stack that you're working with.
Yeah, and the AI COE is, they'll work very close with the platform engineering team because a lot of times the AI COE or the COE will have certain policy that they need to, and they could come in the form of business requirements that they want to establish. And it'll be the platform engineering team who actually implements those policy requirements in the platform. The two teams definitely overlap. In fact, you may have the same person in those teams. So certainly a doable thing. It should be done.
It's sort of like
when we get into the design of those landing zones too, we'll actually see that a lot more concretely by the fact that we have a landing zone that is the platform landing zone, where the platform engineering team are going to be all over that. That's going to be their baby and their responsibility. But you're right, that partnership between the platform engineering teams and the workload teams is super important, because if we can take on some of the disciplines and the templating and apply it to workloads, it just helps everything run more smoothly for the workload teams. But they absolutely need to be working in lockstep with the platform engineering team so that they can compare notes, see how different aspects of the design requirements are going to be impacted.
Now, when we're talking here about Azure Landing Zone design areas, one of the other things is we're talking about, in this discussion, all of these big teams, and you're probably thinking, how big is this organization that they're talking about? And one of the things that we really want to get across here is that even though when we're talking at that very hypothetical level about all of these multitude of teams, and it sounds like that, there's 50 people on this team and 50 people on that team, and oh my God, that's more than work in my actual organization. When we're coming down to this idea of this landing zone design areas, what we're trying to get across to you is that even though these principles might work at scale, they can also work at a much lower level, where you're thinking about, what we want you to do is think about this in a consistent manner. And the landing zone design areas and the way that they're sort of laid out is, think about these essentially in a rough order. And the reason I use rough order is we're going to sort of have a little debate about whether or not one thing should be ahead of the other a little later on. But if you are thinking about this in, importantly, a systematic way, you're going to get a better result. So we've got our environment design areas, which affect the platform foundation, and then the compliance design areas. And we can see here we've got them in blue and purple. We've got Azure billing and Entra, identity and access management, network topology, resource organization, and then we've got security management, platform automation, and DevOps and governance. The recommendation is that you look at each of these areas sort of in sequence, in a degree of order, but what that is really a way of structuring your thinking. By addressing each one of these, it's a structure approach to making sure that you're not going to go and miss something really obvious. And in general, one would follow the other, and that you're not going to sort of get to here and go, actually, we needed to really think about this issue earlier, because that's actually completely changed. So that, to an extent, this is downstream of this, but this is just a recommended structure to look at it.
Yeah, and this echoes some of the conversations that we've been having about what is a COE responsible for. When we're talking about AI workloads, and we were talking about the difference between when is it just another workload, your AI application, and you're following all of the same rules and principles that you do for every other workload, and when does it get AI specific? And there are some things that you need to be aware of, like how LLMs are built, that is very much specific to AI applications. But these areas are really the nuts and bolts for any workloads, which is why they're part of the Azure Landing Zone design. And they translate perfectly into what we were talking about that you need to consider when you're designing an AI workload, because you have to look at things in all of these boxes. And I love that we have a more, as you said, a systematic way to go through and make sure that we've actually had to think about it, and we've made design decisions based on making sure that we fulfill all the requirements. We've answered all the questions in each of these areas.
One of the things I really like about this slide is the last bullet, because what the last bullet is doing is basically saying it's going to evolve. So whatever your setup is today, it's going to change. And that's because of two things. One is the architecture changes, but also you learn things. And so as you're learning and as new technologies come like AI, your platform is going to change too. There's going to be new requirements of the platform, or you learn about certain capacity issues that you may need, that you may follow, that will affect other aspects of your workloads and your platform. So there's just a lot of things that whatever you set up today is probably going to change tomorrow. So, yeah.
There's a saying comes from one of the Terry Pratchett novels, that experience is the result of wisdom, and wisdom is the result of a lack of experience. And what that essentially means is that we have to understand that this is a cycle, that we learn from making mistakes, and that we set in guidelines so that we don't make mistakes again in future. Okay, so
Can I just one more thing along those lines is we knew when you asked the question, how old is a landing zone? How long have they been around? One of the things that we're looking for is the life cycle of the landing zone. How when do we think that we're in a mature model now? Like how many customers are using landing zones, et cetera. And what we've determined is the best way is to see how many customers are actually reviewing their existing landing zones. And what we've found is that more customers are reviewing their landing zones than are implementing landing zones. So that tells us we've actually done something right here. Like the maturity model of the landing zone actually shows that we have enough customers moving into landing zones that this is a good practice to follow.
So just with the way that you've expressed that, it makes then, or implies, that a landing zone isn't just for the deployment or the initial deployment of the application, that a landing zone actually is a framework which the application sits in within its life cycle. Would you say that that's a reasonable interpretation? So that the idea of a landing zone, it's just not the landing zone. You've got the landing and you've got the entire airport, and then you're going home from the airport in a taxi and so on and so forth. Is that a reasonable interpretation?
Yeah, that definitely, that definitely, and it's going to change, and so the more you can review where you have issues, where you see changes happening, and where you see drift, because drift happens also, you need to take those things into account, and you do that through review.
Yeah, so it's almost a way of saying that a landing zone isn't just for deployment. It's almost a way of having a structured ecosystem in which the application exists around the partition of responsibilities, workloads, and other elements. Okay, so let's talk about this first design area and why Azure billing and the Entra tenant should be considered first. Now, the reason I think that the Entra tenant should be considered first is that you can plug a whole lot of things into the Entra tenant, and that identity is the new control plane. Is that a reasonable interpretation? But where does billing, do we need to be thinking about billing from the get-go?
I love the conversation about billing with AI. I think to date, it's been a bit of an afterthought, and I think that is because the organizations are still very much in the experimental stage. They're in the let's run up some workloads and see if we can prove the value. Is this going to be useful to our organization? Are we going to get some really good results out of it, where we're actually going to see some business benefits, whether they're internal productivity improvements or whether it's an increase in sales on the e-commerce side. So there's been a lot more, let's do it and see and try and prove whether or not this is going to be useful for our org before we've actually given any thought into how much this is going to cost us. We're starting to see more of those conversations bubble up as AI workloads become more mature. But it is one of those things that if you think about it when you're doing your initial design, it's easier to make sure that you're tagging resources, that you're able to pull the data that you want about the costs, you understand how AI applications are charged for. And then you don't, if you build some of those components and that consideration into the architecture from the get-go, it does certainly make it easier to then turn around and go, it was useful, and here's kind of the net impact of the cost on our organization, or how that might change if we now go and scale it or make some architecture changes. So it's certainly worth thinking about earlier in the process than we probably have been.
It's interesting also that we've combined billing and Entra into a design area, because they almost do seem sort of somewhat separate from one another. One's your identity boundary, and then the other is obviously how are we thinking about all of this being paid for. There's also the question of, with an Entra tenant for an organization, do you have a separate Entra tenant for an application, or do you use the main organizational one? And that's probably something that you obviously need to think about at the beginning, is does this, if, for those of us that go back to or are still using Active Directory, you wouldn't spin up a new domain for a specific application unless there was a particular reason. But would you spin up a different, essentially, tenancy for a specific workload?
Yeah, and I think it doesn't necessarily come down to specific workloads. We more commonly see that boundary in terms of the intention of use of the application. And a good example of that is dev test versus prod. And if you've been around Microsoft architecture for a while, you might be used to having that conversation when it comes down to how subscriptions inside one tenant are configured, because subscriptions are a billing boundary. But we also have organizations where if you're in a highly regulated industry, you don't want to be deploying test applications anywhere near your production tenancy. It's just too high a risk. So you may actually have a separate Azure tenant, which is your playground, which is your dev and test area, so that you're really minimizing any cross-contamination, both of security risk and of data transfer between those two boundaries. And again, that also provides you with another billing boundary to turn around and go, no, we definitely have this budget set aside in this area for dev test initiatives. That's where it's going to be. But the tenancies are interesting because they do kind of bleed into subscriptions and billing boundaries. And they also bleed into that security and access management boundary as well.
And of course, one of the things that people are aware of or may not be aware of is that just because you've got an Entra ID tenant, you can have objects that exist in other Entra ID tenants have membership as accounts in one. So it's not an Active Directory Forest Trust. It's at a far more individual level, but that you can provide access to those accounts, but then still have that be a security boundary where that's just an object that has access and then is assigned permission. So when we're talking about identity and access in this next design area that follows down from that, it is identity is the primary security boundary. Now, what that statement comes from is in the old days, the security boundary used to be the network perimeter. That is, that everything that was on the outside was bad or possibly hostile. Everything on the inside was possibly good. And that we identified actors based on their MAC address or their network address. With today, where everything's sitting up in the cloud, someone can be accessing something from anywhere. So what we're using as the identifier for whether or not we allow or deny or what we let it do is its actual identity. And that obviously relates very much to how the tenancy works. And then the access management controls indicate, like, how is that identity proved? How are we making sure that we're protecting that identity? So, for example, there's a whole lot of things that you can turn on that will disable an identity if it's got unusual login requirements, or it's trying to do something weird or something like, or it needs to elevate itself and so on. And then we come down into what roles do you want to assign? And do you want to make sure that you've got the ability to elevate roles to perform specific tasks? Because we're moving much more to a just-in-time model, whereas instead of an identity being assigned a role permanently, an identity elevates its role when it needs to perform an administrative task.
I had one other point there is, and I heard about it earlier today, actually, is when you look at Entra and the way identity is managed for AI apps, it's important to realize, that you probably want to have one identity provider, and because as soon as you start to include additional ones, you start to create variety, and the variety is a killer, especially when it comes to identity. And so keeping it to one provider is probably the way you want to think about it for a given tenant. And that's probably why it's described in this manner. But if you have additional points there, yeah.
Well, one of the other things to remember as well, especially when it comes to AI, is that we're moving much more towards this model where each application and that identity is not just about users. Identity is about services and applications. And when you've got AI, remember, one of the things I like to say about AI is like something with a child's curiosity and willingness to say anything because they haven't got the social graces, but with an infinite attention span. So by making sure each of your AI workloads has got an identity, you can restrict what the AI can access in the way that you would restrict what a user can access. So remember that identity is not just about users, it's about applications and services as well.
Yeah. You can assign different levels of permission, and everything should have a zero trust sort of model. Yeah.
Okay, so the next design area is network topology and connectivity. So this is coming down to the idea of when you're deploying an application, there's obviously going to be different elements. You might have a data store, you might have the foundry, you might have how things are distributed, where the front end sits, all of that. How do they need to communicate? And what is the most rational, secure, logical structure in doing that? So it might be planning virtual networks, subnet, connectivity, and segmentation strategies, because you want to, there's a particular segmentation strategy, which is, I think it's called Onion. Onion was how we used to think about it, where you are controlling and being very restrictive about which elements on the network can communicate with others. So as opposed to a local area network where you just bang all your servers in the server room and this server can talk to that server because they're all connected to the same switch, what you're actually doing is you're implementing a whole lot of policies so that even if these two servers are sitting next to one another on the rack and they're plugged into the same switch, they've got policies like IPsec policies so that this server can't talk to that server because they're never meant to talk to one another, so that if an attacker got in and got persistence on one, they couldn't spider across to the other. So do you have any follow-up thoughts?
I'm going to add that it's a really interesting conversation, and it really does come down to your organizational requirements. We see customers, again, especially ones that are in very heavy regulated industries, that go to extra steps in their architecture design to make sure that they're using service endpoints and private endpoints so that their back-end systems aren't available across public IP connections. And we've got a whole range. The interesting thing about each of these design areas is we could make a talk, a webinar on every individual area, because we can go very deep in capability of these areas. I think network topology design is one of them, especially if you do have requirements where you want to make sure that some of those background, if it's the data stores, if it's the LLMs, are really restricted to the next level in terms of what connectivity other systems have to them and vice versa.
Okay, so the next design area that we're going to address is resource organization. And that is where you're thinking about how you're going to do your subscriptions. Now, we actually started talking about this a little before we started the session. And one of the things I brought up is that if you go back far enough before we had management groups, really the subscription was your ultimate security boundary, that you didn't have subscriptions and they certainly weren't interrelated in any way. Ben, you made a point about whether or not you should configure sort of subscription vending, and that we've not only got identity, but that we should really have sort of subscriptions as management boundaries. So at what level do you just say, right, I'm going to spin up a subscription because I've got this particular element of my workload, and that element of the workload is going to sit in the subscription, or where do I have multiple workload elements in a subscription?
Yeah, this is a part of the construct of the landing zone, where subscription is kind of a central management element of how you think about your demarcation. And so as a result, when you look at what is the application, or what is the thing that you're trying to deploy into the environment, you can actually build the resources within that subscription, organize those resources within the subscription for that given workload, and as a result, you could basically stamp out a workload template, if you will. I'm going to call it a template. Marketing would be very upset with that term, but
you're the one from marketing, so.
I know. So I feel the heat on the back of my shirt. But the point is these templates, or these things that could be created before you actually deploy it into an environment, could be used by multiple workload teams. So you could have a resource template, I'm going to call it that for now, in a way that you could actually, what we would call vend the template. We would vend the subscription to various workload teams who could basically use the policies, the subscription organization, the resource organization within the subscription, so that the workload team doesn't need to worry about how that given workload should look like. And so it makes it very easy for that workload team and the platform engineering team to work closer together. The problem, though, becomes, so if you're already thinking about your subscription ahead of time in that first design area, do you then have to go back and retrofit that design area now that you're thinking about your resource organization and the subscription vending concept? So that's where I was getting a little question, how should we be doing this side by side?
And look, I can understand where you're going with that, because I hadn't thought about it when I was thinking about subscription vending. I was only thinking about it as a sort of a management boundary. And one of the things I often think about it is, what people couldn't use resource groups properly. You can do this at the resource group level. Why do you need to go to the super level of the subscription? And I can understand it from, well, there's some compliance regulation over here that means that we've got to have this super boundary, that even though we could go and apply this at the resource group level and do all of our role-based access control and things like that, where you're thinking about it from as well, is that ability to sort of set up subscription templates where when you deploy the subscription, it already goes and deploys a whole lot of extra elements to the subscription in terms of how the subscription's set up, what items are being done in that subscription way, so that it's almost like deploy a whole environment, not just to deploy. Well, I mean, and yes, you can do sort of that with a resource group and a whole lot of automation and things like that. But I sort of understand then what you mean about the subscription vending and how you've got to then decide, is this workload big enough, or are we doing this not only for this particular AI workload, but are we thinking about AI workloads in future where we want to have sort of a very repeatable process?
Exactly. And I'll say one more thing, and maybe this is another thing we can add to the chat below, is around Azure verified modules or infrastructure as code modules like Terraform modules, where that's a great use case for subscription vending, because there you actually know exactly what you want to deploy. But the question is, what's the policies around those things? How does it relate to that platform landing zone? And that's where the vending construct comes into play.
So the next design area that we're looking at is security. Now, one of the things that we've sort of done, and one of the things that we've been doing ourselves at Microsoft through SFI, is making sure that we're recommending that people, where appropriate, used managed identities. That is, that your application has an identity rather than using API keys. And the reason that we're making that recommendation is that even though API keys are ways that things have been done for a very long time, it turns out that they're a bit like sort of nuclear waste, in that often people don't handle them in the appropriate way. So that, yes, they solve a problem, and if you do it right, they're never a problem. The problem is that we see so many instances where people don't handle their APIs keys right, and they go and check it into their GitHub source code, and then suddenly their API key sitting there. And we've all heard about people getting access to things that they shouldn't get access to because someone accidentally left their API key out in the open. So the other area is trying to make sure that from the beginning, when you're looking at this, that you are enforcing the principle of least privilege. That is, that you don't assign unnecessary rights to any identity, that you only assign the rights that are very limited, that only allow that identity to do what it needs to do.
Yeah, I think you nailed it. Really good security 101 principles that you should be applying to any workload.
So the management design area is that you need to, and we talked about this last week when we were talking, or the week before last, when we were talking about sort of monitoring, that the COE can very much influence this idea of what are we actually needing to monitor here? What's a standard set of telemetry, or what is the standard set of things within telemetry that is actually important to us? Because obviously you can turn on the haystack generator and have the biggest haystack possible, which is all of the monitoring data, but it won't necessarily make finding those needles any easier, although AI does make it a bit better. One of the other areas to sort of think about when we're talking about platform versus application a little later on is, do you have a central log analytics workspace or separate log analytics workspaces per application? Also making sure that you're simply keeping everything up to date. One of the things that we know is monitoring, patching, backup, and other operations. So when you're thinking about it in terms of this management area, you're already thinking from the beginning, okay, how do I make this workload resilient? And should something go wrong, should there be data corruption or something like that, how do I roll back to an original, or how do I roll back to a last known good state?
This is another interesting area for the AI COE to take into account, because this is where both business and technical readiness really matter, because with management, there's also an assumption that you understand the criticality of the workload. Like, this is a business critical workload versus a mission critical workload versus just an internally facing workload. So by understanding what the requirements are and the criticality of that workload will then determine what should the reliability of this workload be, what sort of 5 nines, 4 nines, 2 nines sort of requirements you would have. And a lot of that's going to be based on both the business and technical readiness.
And that's a good thing. Sorry, Sonia.
Some of those requirements are going to bleed into the next area of governance, where we can actually use something like Azure Policy to set those configurations. Because if you've got an application that is more mission critical, you want to make sure that it's potentially using a higher quality of storage or like higher level SKUs of products to give you the features that you need to maintain that kind of level of availability. And Azure Policy and governance is one of those areas where we can enforce or audit that those things are in place for the applications that need it.
It's interesting that governance sort of sits a bit further down towards the end of this list of things that you need to think about, I believe the reason is that you've got to figure out all of the things that your thing does before you figure out what elements are relevant in the governance conversation, rather than thinking about these are all the rules that are applied to. Let's work out the technology. Let's work out what we're trying to do first, and then figure out what rules actually have to go in before we look at it. And then the final design area is platform automation and DevOps. And that is, again, that's following on from that idea of, okay, now that we've worked out what all of the elements of this workload are, how do we make sure that they can all be deployed and maintained and modified and updated and iterated on? Now that we've got everything, let's figure out the system at which we're doing it, rather than figuring out what the system is first and then figuring out what elements that we actually want to deploy.
Yeah. I want to make one point there also is one of the things that, and maybe we'll talk about this later, is how do you go about deploying this landing zone? Like, how do you go about deploying a platform landing zone, for instance? And for the last 5 or 6 years, what we've done is we've said, deploy the whole thing. All the design areas should be implemented in this one platform landing zone. And what we've realized actually is that a lot of customers already have a lot of these design areas already understood, already have configured these particular design areas. And so what we've realized is that we need a much more modular approach to deploying these landing zones. And so what we've done basically is broken up the architecture into different modules. And so you can actually deploy 5 different modules for using an infrastructure as code method in our Azure Verified modules in a way that it just makes it much more flexible. And I should definitely put that in the chat here too.
So one of the things on this slide we're talking about is the platform landing zone versus the application landing zone. And the platform landing zone is essentially the ecosystem, or the all of those elements like identity, all of your organizational wide stuff. Almost like if you were going to draw it, you might have a big circle in the middle, call it the platform landing zone, and then spoking off that, you might have different application landing zones, because the platform landing zone is more likely to be consistent for all workloads in the organization, whereas the application landing zones are going to be workload specific. Is that a reasonable interpretation?
Yeah, sounds good. Yeah.
Okay, so we've got an example here. We've got some of the items here. We've got this extremely messy technical diagram, platform landing zone versus application landing zone. If you go to akka.ms 8LZ, you'll be able to sort of drill down into this diagram. But what this is trying to say, without you needing to sort of go down into the deep details of it, is that we can see that we've got sort of this centralized area that's got all of these things that are common dependencies probably across all applications. And then we've got the individual areas, which are the application-specific ones. And that when you are thinking of different teams, you're thinking of your platform team, which is going to be responsible for those more centralized services. And then you've got workload teams that are going to be specifically worried about their particular workload. If you're in a small organization, it all might be the same person. They just put different hats on at different times. But this is another way of thinking about the differences between these two areas. So we talked about platform engineering and we talked about COE a little before. Is there any other distinctions you think we should make between platform landing zone and application landing zones before we get into a specific example of an OpenAI chat application?
I have one actually that I think would be interesting to talk about because we actually talk about it quite a bit in the cloud adoption frameworks scenario around analytics, which are called data landing zones. So a data landing zone actually looks very, very similar to an application landing zone. The primary difference is that it's focused on the data product that is going to be hosted in a deployed environment. So it looks very similar to an application landing zone because it has the same sort of elements, the same sort of requirements the specific requirements that you would have for that environment for that data. And it's going to have similar sorts of operations oriented processes, but it's demarcated or differentiated from the platform landing zone because the data landing zone will end up inheriting a lot of the function, a lot of the requirements or the regulations, the compliance of the platform landing zone in a similar way as the application landing zone does.
And it would seem, I imagine, at some point, maybe even that will be, I don't know, maybe even having to include data landing zones, because data would obviously be almost a separate resource from obviously the ecosystem of the platform and then the application. And you might have multiple applications interacting with the same data estate, and that you need to make sure, because data is your organization's crown jewels. That is the thing that your organization's generating and using to sort of make its meat and potatoes and its actual money. Okay, so here we have an Azure OpenAI chat baseline example. And this is up on our learn.microsoft.com. And what it is it's a theoretical application that's a single agent hosted in Azure AI Foundry. It receives user messages and then queries data stores. So here we don't have a separate data landing zone. We've just got a bunch of different data stores, and my eyes aren't good enough to actually remember where each one of these elements are. But that we can see here when I do actually go in and put on my glasses that we've got Azure storage, and that's all sitting in the sort of the blue area, and we'll sort of zoom in a little bit more on this later. And that's where the data is sitting in the application landing zone in this particular one. So when we're going through this particular application, what we've done is we've been able to look at what the platform team resources and responsibilities are and what the application team responsibilities are, assuming that you had that demarcated. And some of these might seem obvious, and some of them might be, well, yeah, but it could go either way. So we start with the Azure firewall in the hub network. Now, we've got hubs and we've got spokes. The hubs is everything centralized. It makes sense for that to be a platform team resource. Bastion, we're giving access to these resources. That's handled at the platform level. Spoke virtual networks, where the workload's deployed, we're sitting there and saying that the infrastructure responsibility is the platform team. They're the ones that have built the spoke. They will manage the spoke. The routes that do the tunneling and push network traffic in that direction, again, a responsibility of the platform team. The governance constraints. So what are the policies that would be, the reason I'm bringing up the policy element is that when we get across to the workload team, we've also got policy elements there. So what's a good example of a policy that might exist at the platform level?
Well, anything that relates to your identity, well, not everything, but you have your identity will most likely be managed at the platform level. And there's going to be some sort of policy that relates to how you manage that identity, most likely from a zero trust, starting with zero trust. And then you'll have permissions, where permissions may or may not be at the platform level. It could actually be at both the platform and the application levels.
Now, also, we've got DNS. Now, the reason that you would have that obviously at the platform level is that DNS is probably going to be fairly central for your entire organization, and it makes sense to handle that at the platform level rather than everybody spinning up their own DNS server for a specific workload. And that would include DNS resolution, centralized DNS servers rather than, roll your own. And then handling distributed denial of service protection, that would be where you're sitting there going, well, everything, when we're looking at the shield between the external world and our internal world, we want to handle that at that particular platform team level. So when we get down to the workload team responsibilities, we've got the AI Foundry instance. Now, Foundry is obviously a managed service provided by Microsoft. And then we'll have the endpoints. The actual application itself might be sitting in an Azure web app. AI search, again, that's a managed thing, but interacting with it. So obviously at a certain point of level, the platform team for that one's Microsoft because they manage AI search, but your interaction with it and your configuration would be on a per workload basis. Storage, container registry, application gateway, key vaults. So you would have an individual key vault per application, which is a common way of doing it. Now we've got here monitor logs and application insights. Is it better for there to be the configuration of obviously monitoring and telemetry to occur at the application level and it goes into a central log analytics workspace, or should each workload have its own log analytics workspace, or will that really depend on the workload? It depends.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of pros and cons for both, and it really does depend. It's a little bit about what your specific requirements are for this particular application, but it's also influenced by how the rest of your architecture is structured across your organization for monitoring of both the applications in general and the underlying platform, which is going to have an impact on the availability and performance of your applications as well. So no, I think that one's definitely, it depends. I did notice that, and I'm not sure without zooming into the diagram if it's on there, API gateway as well is something that we need to be including in there. Azure API management, especially because the API gateway has very specific features for LLMs and AI workloads now that are really useful. So you're probably more likely to include that inside your workload landing zone as well.
And finally, we've got Azure policy sitting here, which is just that you work out what the specific policies are related to your workload, as opposed to the generalized policies that might be existing at the platform level. Okay, so the Azure Landing Zone Accelerator. Would either of you like to talk to what an Azure Landing Zone Accelerator is?
I kind of opened that can of worms earlier. So there's the Azure Landing Zone Accelerator for the platform landing zone, which is what we're talking about in when you go to the Azure portal. So when you go to the Azure portal, you have the option of basically going through a UI that will take you through a bunch of different decisions that you can make before you go about deploying that landing zone, which is quite nice because that set of processes make it very clear as to just make sure you don't miss anything. So it's really nice for that. That said, there are obviously a lot of things that you may or may not want to tailor or customize for your organization, and so you may actually want to use one of the accelerator in the for using the CLI, or you may want to use the bicep templates, for instance, that may make it easier for you to tailor. As far as the way you go about it, we're getting close to time, so I'll go ahead and finish there. But one thing I wanted to point out is that's for the platform landing zone. There are a bunch of solution accelerators that you can also use, and those are not found in the portal. Those are typically found in the GitHub repositories related to the solution accelerators. And those are actually, you can find those on the Azure Architecture Center. Those are going to be, there's one now, that reference architecture that we're just showing, and there will be a future ones coming in the next couple months.
Anyway, so we're at the end of this session. Today we talked about understanding landing zones and why your AI COE should encourage your organization to use one. We talked about the different landing zone design areas. We talked about platform landing zones and application landing zones. And we reviewed one of the landing zone ideas that's up on the Microsoft website. I've been Orin Thomas. Thank you very much, Ben. Thank you very much, Sonia. If you've got any questions for us, feel free to contact us on our social handles. Thank you very much for your attention and have a wonderful day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.